It started with a single phone call from Windsor staff, brief, cold, and delivered with the kind of formality that usually signals a royal crisis. But when Lady Louise quietly lowered the phone and disappeared from view, even longtime palace aides sensed something had shattered behind the scenes. Because this was not just about horses. It was about access, legacy, and a painful message sent from deep inside the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Lady Louise had remained one of the quietest figures within the younger generation of royals. She was never associated with palace drama, public feuds, or the endless cycle of royal headlines that seemed to consume so many others connected to the crown. Instead, reports suggest she built her identity around duty, privacy, and the traditions that once defined the late Queen Elizabeth's world. And nowhere was that connection reportedly stronger than inside the Windsor stables. Insiders whisper that the stables were never simply a hobby to Louise. They represented familiarity during periods of grief, stability during moments of royal uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, one of the last emotional links to the grandparents who had shaped so much of her life behind closed palace doors. That is why the alleged suspension of her riding privileges sent such shockwaves through royal circles. It felt deeply personal. Far more personal than the palace was willing to publicly acknowledge. According to various interpretations emerging from palace administrative streams, the message delivered to Louise was described as formal, immediate, and painfully direct. Sources familiar with Windsor operations claim certain access arrangements were being reviewed, while others reportedly described the decision as part of wider changes quietly unfolding under King Charles's reign. But the silence surrounding the matter only intensified speculation. Staff members were allegedly instructed not to discuss the issue publicly. An unusual level of secrecy for what some initially attempted to frame as a routine procedural adjustment. And within royal households, silence is often the loudest warning of all. Palace observers quickly began asking the same question. Why now? Why would Lady Louise, arguably one of the least controversial members of the royal family, suddenly find herself at the center of such an emotionally devastating decision? What made the situation even more unsettling was the emotional response reportedly witnessed afterward. Insiders claim Louise appeared deeply shaken following the call, withdrawing from conversations and avoiding areas of Windsor where she had once felt most at peace. Some reports suggest Prince Edward was left furious behind closed doors, while Duchess Sophie was described as deeply unsettled by the sudden change in tone coming from palace administrators. For years, Edward and Sophie had carefully maintained a reputation for loyalty to the institution without demanding the spotlight. They represented stability, restraint, and what many royal traditionalists viewed as the surviving spirit of quiet service. But now, according to whispers circulating among royal watchers, even they appeared blindsided by the coldness of the decision. And perhaps that is what transformed this from a private family disappointment into something much larger, because this was no longer simply about riding privileges. The symbolism surrounding Windsor itself carries enormous emotional weight. Right inside the monarchy. The late Queen's connection to horses was legendary. Prince Philip's influence on Louise's passion for carriage driving was deeply documented through years of carefully protected family moments. To revoke access to that world even temporarily felt to many observers like the severing of an emotional inheritance. Reports suggest some palace insiders privately feared the move would be interpreted as a message about changing priorities within the monarchy itself. A message that sentiment, history, and personal loyalty may no longer carry the same protection they once did during Queen Elizabeth's reign. Royal commentators also began quietly noting how dramatically the atmosphere around the monarchy has shifted since King Charles assumed the throne. The institution that once operated through deeply personal understandings now appears increasingly governed by structure, streamlining, and institutional control. Different interpretations of recent royal restructuring suggest several long-standing arrangements across royal estates are being reassessed. However, within the context of Lady Louise's situation, many believe the emotional consequences may have been underestimated. because unlike senior royals shaped by decades of public controversy, Louise was widely viewed as someone who never sought influence or privilege for its own sake. She simply belonged to that world in a way that felt genuine, inherited through affection rather than ambition. Which is precisely why the reaction from royal watchers became so intense. As speculation spread, media insiders reportedly began revisiting earlier whispers that tensions inside certain royal households had been quietly building for months. Some interpretations suggest there were disagreements over estate management, scheduling authority, and access arrangements connected to Windsor itself. Others claim the issue may reflect broader efforts to redefine who maintains influence inside the future monarchy. Yet despite the growing rumors, the palace continued refusing to publicly clarify the situation, allowing uncertainty to grow into something far more damaging. And in the absence of answers, the emotional image of Lady Louise left behind became impossible for many people to ignore. A young royal, reportedly heartbroken over losing access to a place that symbolized family, memory, and belonging. But the deeper shock was not the restriction itself, it was the growing belief that order may have originated from a far more powerful royal figure than anyone expected. For years, Lady Louise was quietly seen as the granddaughter who inherited more than Queen Elizabeth's affection. She inherited her trust. That was why the sudden rupture at Windsor felt almost impossible to believe. Because the stables were never just buildings and horses. To Louise, they were one of the last living connections to the late Queen herself. Long before the current whispers surrounding Windsor began spreading through royal circles, Lady Louise had already carved out a unique place within the family. She was not known for demanding headlines or competing for influence. Instead, insiders often described her as one of the most grounded younger royals, a figure shaped less by status and more by tradition, discipline, and loyalty to the quieter values that once defined the monarchy under Queen Elizabeth II. Reports suggest that the late Queen saw something deeply familiar in Louise, particularly in the way she approached royal life with patience rather than entitlement. And nowhere was that bond reportedly more visible than in their shared connection to horses, carriage driving, and the emotional sanctuary that Windsor had quietly become for Louise over the years. According to palace observers, Prince Philip played an equally important role in shaping that world around her. Different interpretations from those familiar with royal family traditions suggest. Louise's passion for carriage driving was encouraged personally by Philip himself, who reportedly viewed her as one of the few younger royals genuinely interested in preserving those traditions, rather than treating them as ceremonial obligations. While many members of the younger generation moved toward modern royal branding and public-facing projects, Louise allegedly found comfort in the routines, disciplines, and quiet rituals that reminded older courtiers of another era entirely. That is why the atmosphere surrounding the current situation feels so emotionally charged. Because this was never merely about access to property. It was about the survival of memory. After Queen Elizabeth's death, reports suggest Windsor became even more emotionally important to Louise. Sources close to palace staff whisper that she spent significant periods of personal time near the stables in the months that followed, seeking distance from the growing pressures surrounding the monarchy's transition into a new reign. For Louise, according to various royal commentators, the Windsor grounds carried echoes of the family structure that once existed under the late Queen, a system built around continuity, personal bonds, and carefully protected traditions. However, as King Charles's reign continues reshaping the institution, many insiders now believe those older emotional protections are beginning to disappear. And for some observers, Louise's reported heartbreak symbolizes something much larger than one painful decision. What makes the situation particularly difficult for royal watchers to process is a contrast between Louise's public image and the apparent severity of the restriction placed upon her. She was never associated with scandal, never linked to palace rebellion or public embarrassment. In fact, many insiders quietly viewed her as exactly the kind of royal the institution claims to value: measured, respectful, and deeply aware of her position within the hierarchy. That is why the public reaction shifted so dramatically once we were there. Persons of her emotional withdrawal began circulating. People were not simply reacting to the loss of riding privileges. They were reacting to the possibility that even loyalty itself no longer guarantees protection inside the modern monarchy. Royal commentators have also pointed to the symbolism surrounding Windsor during this entire controversy. The stables are not viewed merely as operational spaces within the royal estate. They represent continuity stretching back through generations of the crown. Queen Elizabeth's devotion to horses became part of her identity for decades, while Prince Philip's mentorship of Louise reportedly deepened her emotional attachment to that world even further. To suddenly place barriers around that connection feels, to some royal insiders, like severing a final emotional thread tying Louise to the people who shaped her most deeply. And because the palace has remained almost entirely silent, speculation continues filling the void left behind. Some interpretations now suggest the situation reflects a broader institutional struggle unfolding quietly beneath the surface of the monarchy itself. Reports whisper of growing tensions over control, influence, and the future structure of royal operations under King Charles's leadership. Others believe certain senior figures may view emotional traditions as secondary to modernization and tighter administrative control. But regardless of where the truth ultimately lies, the emotional damage surrounding Lady Louise's situation has already become impossible to ignore. Because within royal history, the most painful fractures are often not public betrayals, they are the silent moments when family, legacy, and belonging begin slipping away behind palace walls. And according to whispers emerging from palace administrative circles, the answer may have less to do with horses, and far more to do with a growing internal struggle over royal control. At first, aides reportedly dismissed the situation as a temporary administrative matter. But behind the polished language and carefully managed silence, insiders claimed tensions had already been escalating for months inside Windsor itself. What appeared minor from the outside was, according to some royal observers, becoming deeply personal. As whispers surrounding Lady Louise's restricted access continued spreading through royal circles, the explanation offered. Behind palace walls reportedly began shifting depending on who was asked. Some insiders described the issue as part of routine operational adjustments tied to King Charles's broader modernization efforts. Others quietly insisted there was far more happening beneath the surface. Because according to various interpretations emerging from palace administrative circles, Windsor itself has been undergoing a slow but dramatic transformation since the beginning of Charles's reign. A transformation centered not only around efficiency and control, but around redefining who holds influence inside the monarchy's future structure. And somewhere inside that restructuring, Lady Louise allegedly found herself caught in a battle she never expected to become part of. Reports suggest disagreements had already been building for months over estate access, scheduling authority, and oversight connected to royal properties. Different interpretations claim several senior figures within the institution began pushing for tighter administrative control over areas that once operated through long-standing family understandings rather than rigid formal systems. Under Queen Elizabeth, many arrangements report. DLY functioned through trust, personal relationships, and quiet agreements shaped over decades. But according to royal commentators familiar with Charles's evolving vision for the monarchy, that atmosphere has steadily changed. The new reign, insiders whisper, has become increasingly focused on structure, accountability, and centralized authority. While some view those changes as necessary modernization, others fear the emotional fabric that once held the family together is slowly being stripped away. And it was within that atmosphere that Louise's situation allegedly became far more complicated than anyone outside Windsor first realized. Sources close to palace staff claim frustrations intensified behind closed doors after certain access schedules and estate arrangements were reviewed earlier this year. While official explanations remained vague, whispers suggest emotions became particularly strained when younger royals were quietly informed that traditional privileges could no longer be assumed under the new institutional approach. For someone like Louise, whose connection to Windsor reportedly came from memory and family attachment, rather than status, the emotional impact may have been devastating. Because to her, the stables represented continuity, stability, a final connection to a version of royal life that seemed to disappear after Queen Elizabeth's death. What has made the controversy especially explosive is the growing perception that younger royals are slowly being pushed toward the edges of the institution unless they serve a direct operational purpose. Royal watchers have increasingly questioned whether the monarchy's current restructuring leaves room for figures like Lady Louise at all. She had always existed in a unique position close enough to the institution to inherit its traditions, but distant enough to avoid becoming consumed by its public battles. However, according to palace insiders, the recent climate inside Windsor has become far less sentimental and far more strategic. Some reports even suggest certain senior figures view emotional attachments to royal spaces as secondary to broader institutional priorities. And if true, that would represent one of the sharpest cultural shifts the monarchy has experienced in decades. The emotional atmosphere reportedly worsened after a recent private family discussion that insiders now describe as usually tense. While details remain heavily guarded, various interpretations suggest the meeting centered around future operational control, estate boundaries, and expectations for the younger generation of royals moving forward. Sources whisper that emotions escalated quickly behind closed doors, particularly when long-standing assumptions about access and family tradition were allegedly challenged directly. For palace staff observing the aftermath, the change in mood was impossible to ignore. Relationships that once appeared stable suddenly seemed strained. Conversations reportedly became shorter, colder, more guarded. And Louise herself was said to appear increasingly withdrawn in the days that followed. That emotional shift is precisely what has transformed this story from royal gossip into something far more unsettling. Because beneath the discussions about schedules, administration, and property oversight lies a deeper question many royal observers are now asking in private. What happens when the monarchy begins prioritizing institutional control over emotional continuity? Under Queen Elizabeth, tradition often carried emotional meaning alongside ceremonial importance. But under regarding the pressure of transition, illness, and modernization, insiders fear the monarchy may be entering a colder era, one where sentiment is viewed as weakness rather than stability. And for Lady Louise, according to those closest to the situation, that realization may have arrived with painful force. Because the Windsor she believed would always remain connected to family memory now reportedly feels governed by rules that no longer recognize those emotional ties in the same way. The quiet granddaughter once seen as protected by loyalty and tradition suddenly appears vulnerable to the same unforgiving machinery reshaping the entire institution. And as palace silence continues fueling speculation, one haunting possibility keeps resurfacing among royal commentators: that Louise's situation is not an isolated dispute at all, but part of a much larger shift unfolding behind the walls of Windsor. But the real turning point came after one emotional encounter that insiders now describe as impossible for Louise to forget. Witnesses reportedly noticed the change immediately. Lady Louise, normally composed, quiet, and deeply disciplined, appeared visibly shaken after leaving a restricted Windsor area. One afternoon. And according to multiple palace whispers, what happened behind those doors left her in tears before she could even reach her car. By that point, tensions inside Windsor had reportedly been building for weeks beneath carefully controlled silence. Palace staff had grown accustomed to the colder atmosphere surrounding recent administrative changes, but insiders claim something about this particular encounter felt different, more personal, more final. According to various interpretations emerging from royal circles, Louise had entered the meeting still believing the restrictions surrounding the stables might eventually be reconsidered. After all, many of the people involved understood what Windsor represented to her emotionally. This was not simply a location connected to royal duty. It was the last surviving piece of a family world shaped by Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. A world Louise reportedly believed would always remain untouched by palace politics. But insiders now whisper that what she heard behind those closed doors shattered that belief completely. Reports suggest Louise was informed the restrictions would remain in place indefinitely, with certain accuracy. SS arrangements allegedly being reclassified under broader operational policies tied to the restructuring of royal estates. The language may have sounded procedural on paper, but according to those familiar with the atmosphere inside Windsor that day, the emotional impact was immediate. Staff members reportedly observed Louise leaving the restricted area visibly distressed, struggling to maintain the composure that had long defined her public image. And for many inside the palace, that reaction became impossible to forget. Because Lady Louise was never known for emotional displays. She had inherited the late Queen's restraint, Prince Philip's discipline, and the quiet endurance expected from royals raised far from public chaos. Which is why seeing her reportedly reduced to tears sent shockwaves through those who witnessed the aftermath. What made the moment even more explosive was the reaction unfolding privately within her own family. Sources close to palace operations claim Prince Edward was left deeply furious after learning how final the decision had become. Different interpretations suggest he viewed the situation not merely as an administrative dispute, but as a painful rejection. Tian of long-standing family understandings that had existed for decades under Queen Elizabeth's reign. For Edward, according to royal insiders, Windsor was never supposed to become a battlefield governed solely by policy and hierarchy. It represented continuity, memory, and emotional inheritance. And seeing his daughter emotionally devastated over a place tied so closely to her grandparents reportedly intensified tensions behind closed doors in ways the public still does not fully understand. Meanwhile, whispers surrounding Duchess Sophie painted a picture of someone desperately attempting to calm a situation already spiraling beyond private control. Reports suggest Sophie tried quietly mediating conversations between certain royal households, hoping to prevent the issue from escalating into a lasting fracture within the family. But insiders claim the emotional atmosphere after the encounter became increasingly icy, with communications reportedly growing formal, guarded, and painfully restrained. Palace aides allegedly noticed a sharp shift in tone during internal discussions, while some royal commentators began openly questioning whether the old emotional agreements that once went. Verned family relationships inside Windsor were now collapsing entirely under the pressure of institutional change. And perhaps that is what made this moment so emotionally devastating for royal observers watching from the outside. Because Louise's reported tears symbolized something larger than personal disappointment. They represented the growing fear that the monarchy's transformation under King Charles may be rewriting rules that once protected emotional loyalty inside the family. Under Queen Elizabeth, tradition often carried human meaning alongside royal protocol. But according to palace whispers, the newer system unfolding inside Windsor appears increasingly focused on structure, authority, and long-term control. Some insiders even suggest the monarchy is entering a colder era where sentiment no longer carries the influence it once did. And if that interpretation is true, then Louise's heartbreak may only be the beginning of a much wider emotional shift inside the institution. Royal commentators also began noting how rapidly public sympathy turned toward Louise after details of the encounter started circulating. Unlike scandals involving ambition or public rebellion, this company, a controversy felt deeply personal and painfully human. A young royal known for humility and loyalty suddenly appeared isolated by the very institution she had quietly respected her entire life. And the more silence the palace maintained, the more speculation intensified. Questions spread across royal circles about whether younger members of the family are interested in taking over the throne. We're gradually losing the informal protections previous generations once relied upon. Because if someone like Lady Louise could reportedly be pushed aside despite years of quiet devotion, many began wondering who might be next. Yet even as emotions exploded privately inside Windsor, another question began spreading through royal circles: who truly benefits from Louise losing her place there? The House of Windsor has always operated on invisible rules, understandings that rarely needed to be spoken aloud. But insiders now whisper that those old protections are disappearing one by one. And Lady Louise's situation may be the clearest sign yet that a silent power shift is underway inside the monarchy. For decades, the royal family survived not simply because of official protocol, but because of the delicate network of private understandings, immediately maintained behind palace walls. Under Queen Elizabeth II, many relationships inside the institution reportedly depended on trust, continuity, and emotional balance rather than rigid enforcement. Certain spaces belonged to certain people not because contracts demanded it, but because tradition had quietly protected those connections for generations. Windsor itself became one of the clearest examples of that system. It was not merely a royal estate. It was an emotional stronghold tied to memory, loyalty, and family identity. But according to palace insiders, the monarchy emerging under King Charles is operating by a very different philosophy, one increasingly focused on structure, authority, and institutional survival over personal sentiment. Reports suggest Charles's reign has become deeply centered around long-term restructuring efforts designed to redefine the future shape of the monarchy. Since ascending the throne, whispers surrounding streamlining and slimming down the royal institution have only intensified. Publicly, those discussions were often framed around efficiency and modernization. However, behind closed doors, insiders claim the consequences may be far more emotionally disruptive than the public fully understands. Senior courtiers are reportedly re-evaluating access arrangements, household privileges, estate oversight, and the future roles of family members who once operated comfortably within the older royal system. And according to various interpretations from royal commentators, Lady Louise's current situation may be one of the first deeply personal examples of what that transition actually looks like when it moves beyond public strategy and begins affecting real family relationships. What has unsettled royal observers most is the growing sense that Louise became collateral damage in a much larger institutional shift she never intended to be part of. She was never viewed as a threat to the monarchy, never associated with palace infighting or struggles for influence. In many ways, she represented the exact opposite of modern royal conflict: quiet, loyal, grounded. A young royal more connected to heritage and private duty than media attention or public branding. But insiders now whisper that those very qualities may no longer hold the same value within the evolving structure surrounding King Charles's reign, because the monarchy now applies pairs increasingly governed by systems rather than sentiment, strategy rather than emotional continuity. Royal commentators have repeatedly drawn comparisons between the atmosphere under Queen Elizabeth and the one emerging now. Under the late Queen, there was reportedly a deep understanding that emotional traditions helped stabilize the institution during periods of crisis. Family spaces carried symbolic meaning. Personal attachments mattered. Informal understandings were often preserved because they reinforced loyalty and continuity inside the crown itself. However, sources familiar with current palace dynamics claim the newer approach, unfolding behind the scenes, feels noticeably colder, more administrative, more controlled. Some insiders even describe it as a monarchy slowly replacing emotional inheritance with institutional management. And for many royal watchers, Louise's reported heartbreak became symbolic of that transformation in the most painful way possible. The deeper fear spreading through royal circles is not merely about one restricted area at Windsor. It is about what the situation suggests regarding the future treatment of younger royals who exist outside the monarchy. His core operational structure. Questions are now quietly surfacing about whether there is still room within the institution for figures shaped by loyalty and tradition if they no longer serve a direct strategic purpose. Because if even Lady Louise, widely viewed as one of the most respectful and unproblematic members of the younger generation, could reportedly lose protections once considered unquestionable, then many believe the invisible rules governing the monarchy may be disappearing faster than anyone expected. And as those whispers continue growing louder, the emotional contrast becomes increasingly impossible to ignore. Queen Elizabeth's monarchy was often described as deeply human beneath its formal exterior, built on relationships carefully protected through decades of private understanding. But the newer system now taking shape inside Windsor appears increasingly driven by hierarchy, consolidation, and institutional control. To some royal insiders, the transition may be necessary for survival. To others, it feels like the slow dismantling of the emotional bonds that once held the family together during its darkest moments. But what truly stunned royal watchers was the reason. CDON coming from those who once believed Windsor would always remain Louise's safe haven. The moment whispers of Louise's tears reached the public, sympathy spread rapidly across royal circles. Because unlike many royal controversies built around ambition or scandal, This story felt painfully human. A young royal who had asked for very little suddenly appeared to lose the one place where she felt closest to the people she loved most. Almost overnight, the tone surrounding the controversy shifted. What had initially been dismissed by some commentators as a quiet internal disagreement inside Windsor suddenly became something far more emotional in the eyes of the public. Reports suggest sympathy for Lady Louise began growing rapidly online, particularly among royal supporters who had long viewed her as one of the last genuinely uncontroversial figures connected to the crown. Unlike other royal narratives fueled by interviews, memoirs, accusations, or public feuds, Louise's story carried none of the usual elements of palace warfare. There was no ambition attached to her name, no campaign for influence, no attempt to challenge the institution. Instead, what people saw was a young woman, deeply connected to her grandparents' legacy, appearing emotionally devastated after losing access to a place that symbolized family, stability, and memory. Royal commentators quickly began revisiting Queen Elizabeth's affection for Louise, describing it as one of the quieter but deeply meaningful bonds inside the family. Various interpretations from palace insiders suggest the late queen admired Louise precisely because she reminded her of an older generation of royals less interested in publicity and more comfortable with duty carried out privately. Prince Philip's mentorship reportedly strengthened that connection even further. Sources familiar with Windsor traditions claim Philip took enormous pride in Louise's interest in carriage driving and country life, seeing in her a continuation of values he feared were slowly disappearing from the monarchy itself. That is why the current situation feels so emotionally loaded for many royal observers. Because in their eyes, the controversy is no longer simply about restricted access. It feels like the painful unraveling of an inheritance built on trust between generations. Insiders whisper that even some palace staff privately struggled with the decision. While public silence remained firmly in place, reports suggest there were individuals within royal operations who believed the emotional consequences surrounding Louise's situation had been badly underestimated. Different interpretations claim certain aides quietly questioned whether applying such rigid institutional policies would be effective. To someone like Louise, risked damaging the monarchy's public image in ways senior figures had failed to anticipate. After all, Lady Louise had spent years building a reputation for humility and restraint. She stayed away from scandal, avoided royal theatrics, maintained her studies and responsibilities without seeking the spotlight that often consumed others connected to the institution. And perhaps that is exactly why public sympathy became so overwhelming once whispers of her distress emerged. The symbolism surrounding Windsor itself only intensified those emotions further. To outsiders, the stables may appear like one small piece of a massive royal estate. But according to royal historians and commentators, they represented something far more personal to Louise. They carried memories of Prince Philip's guidance, Queen Elizabeth's warmth, and a version of family life that reportedly felt protected from the harsher realities of palace politics. In many ways, Windsor had become emotionally sacred ground for her, which is why the idea of losing access to that space struck such a powerful emotional chord with the public. It transformed the controversy from an internal royal adjustment into something deeply relatable: the fear of losing the places that connect people to those they have already lost. As public attention intensified, questions also began emerging about whether the decision might eventually be reversed. Some royal commentators suggested the growing wave of sympathy could place pressure on palace officials to quietly reconsider the restrictions before the situation causes deeper reputational damage. Others, however, believe the controversy has already exposed something far more significant about the monarchy's evolving structure under King Charles. Because regardless of whether access is eventually restored, insiders claim the emotional fracture inside the family may already be impossible to fully repair. Trust, once damaged behind palace walls, rarely returns to what it once was. And beneath every discussion about estate policy, modernization, or restructuring, one painful reality continues haunting royal observers. Lady Louise's situation has forced many people to confront a difficult question about the monarchy's future. What happens when an institution built on tradition begins severing the emotional ties that once gave those traditions meaning? Under Queen Elizabeth, loyalty and sentiment reportedly carried enormous weight inside family relationships. But according to growing whispers from within Windsor, the monarchy now emerging may operate very differently, colder, more strategic, and far less guided by personal history. But insiders now claim the situation may already have gone too far, and the emotional damage inside the family could last far beyond Windsor itself. Behind palace gates, silence often speaks louder than public statements. And according to royal insiders, the atmosphere surrounding Lady Louise's situation has become increasingly tense, with certain family relationships now described as deeply strained. What once looked like a private disagreement may now be evolving into something much larger. In royal history, the most dangerous fractures rarely begin with publication. Interpersonal confrontations. They begin quietly. A shorter conversation at a family gathering. A colder tone during private meetings. Invitations handled differently. Familiar routines suddenly disappearing without explanation. And according to whispers now circulating through palace administrative circles, that exact pattern has allegedly begun unfolding inside Windsor since the controversy surrounding Lady Louise first erupted behind closed doors. What started as emotional fallout over restricted access to the stables has reportedly expanded into a far more uncomfortable atmosphere affecting multiple royal households. Insiders claim the tension is no longer isolated to Louise herself. It is spreading outward, slowly reshaping relationships that once appeared stable beneath the surface of the monarchy. Sources familiar with recent palace dynamics suggest emotional distance has quietly begun forming between certain members of the royal family, particularly as disagreements surrounding tradition, authority, and institutional restructuring continue intensifying. While public appearances remain carefully controlled, reports indicate interactions behind closed doors have become noticeably more formal and emotionally restrained. Royal commentators whisper that gatherings once defined by routine familiarity now reportedly carry an uncomfortable heaviness beneath the surface. Conversations are said to end quicker. Certain topics allegedly go unspoken entirely. And for many longtime palace observers, that shift feels deeply symbolic. Because under Queen Elizabeth, preserving emotional balance within the family was often viewed as essential to preserving stability within the institution itself. Prince Edward, according to multiple royal insiders, has become increasingly protective of Louise throughout the controversy. Different interpretations suggest he was deeply shaken not only by his daughter's reported emotional distress, but by what the situation revealed about the monarchy's evolving priorities under King Charles. For Edward, Windsor represented continuity with the world his parents built over decades, a system where emotional loyalty still mattered alongside hierarchy and duty. Reports now suggest he has grown more guarded privately, focusing heavily on shielding Louise from the intensifying speculation surrounding the controversy. And while Edward has always maintained a reputation for restraint and diplomacy, insiders whisper that the emotional strain behind palace walls may be testing even his patience in ways rarely seen before. Meanwhile, Louise herself is reportedly withdrawing further from public-facing royal life. Palace commentators claim the normally composed young royal has become increasingly private since the controversy intensified, avoiding unnecessary visibility while remaining emotionally close to her immediate family. Sources whisper that the situation has affected her more deeply than many senior figures initially anticipated. Because for Louise, according to those familiar with her relationship to Windsor, this was never simply about physical access to a location. It was about belonging, about memory, about feeling connected to the grandparents whose influence shaped her identity within the monarchy itself. And once those emotional foundations begin cracking inside royal life, insiders warn the damage can linger for years beneath the surface. What has made the atmosphere even more difficult to contain is the growing struggle among palace aides attempting to manage public speculation. The palace's continued silence, intended perhaps to minimize attention, has instead created an expanding vacuum filled by whispers, interpretations, and increasingly emotional reactions from royal observers. Some insiders reportedly fear the controversy has already become larger than administrators expected because it touches something deeply personal in the public imagination. People understand institutional disagreements, but the image of Lady Louise emotionally isolated from a place connected so closely to Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip has transformed the situation into something far more haunting. It no longer feels like palace policy. It feels like emotional exile. Royal commentators are now openly warning about the potential long-term consequences inside the family itself, because history has shown repeatedly that unresolved tensions within the monarchy rarely disappear completely. They harden over time. They settle beneath formal appearances and ceremonial smiles until years later the emotional distance becomes impossible to repair. And according to various interpretations emerging from royal circles, there is growing concern that the current atmosphere inside Windsor may already be moving in that direction.
Not
through dramatic public confrontation, but through quiet emotional separation slowly deepening behind palace walls. The most unsettling part, however, may be the realization that nobody inside the institution appears fully capable of stopping the emotional drift now unfolding. The monarchy remains publicly united, but insiders claim the private atmosphere has become increasingly fragile as modernization collides with tradition, structure clashes with sentiment, and institutional priorities begin overriding personal bonds once considered untouchable. And for many royal watchers, Lady Louise's heartbreak has become the emotional symbol of that larger transformation, a reminder that even the quietest and most loyal members of the family are no longer immune from the colder realities reshaping the crown. And as Windsor attempts to move forward in silence, one haunting reality continues to linger over the entire royal family. In royal history, the deepest wounds are rarely caused by public scandals. They come from private heartbreaks hidden behind palace walls, moments when loyalty collides with power, and family bonds are tested against the cold machinery of the crown. And for many watches, seeing this unfold, Lady Louise's tears may symbolize something far bigger than a dispute over stables. What began as whispers surrounding restricted access inside Windsor has slowly transformed into something much heavier in the minds of royal observers. Because beneath the discussions about administration, restructuring, and institutional policy lies a deeper emotional truth many people can now feel instinctively. The House of Windsor appears to be changing. Not publicly through dramatic announcements or sweeping declarations, but quietly, through moments like this, moments where tradition collides with modernization, where emotional inheritance clashes against institutional control, and where people once protected by loyalty suddenly appear vulnerable to a colder royal system emerging behind the scenes. For decades, Queen Elizabeth II represented stability, not simply because she protected the institution, but because she understood the emotional foundations that held it together. Reports suggest she believed continuity inside the monarchy depended as much on family bonds as official structures. Windsor itself reflected that philosophy. It was more than a residence, more than royal property. It became a sanctuary where family memory, tradition, and personal loyalty quietly survived beneath the pressure of public life. And according to royal insiders, Lady Louise embodied that older spirit more than many people realized. Her connection to the stables, to carriage driving, and to the world Prince Philip introduced her to was never performative. It was deeply personal, which is precisely why the public reaction became so emotional once whispers of her heartbreak began spreading beyond palace walls. Now, however, many royal commentators believe Windsor is entering a very different era. An era increasingly defined by structure over sentiment, strategy over emotion, and institutional efficiency over private understanding. Some insiders argue those changes are necessary for the monarchy's survival during a period of enormous pressure and transition. King Charles faces challenges unlike any modern sovereign before him: health concerns, public scrutiny, constitutional pressure, and the burden of reshaping the crown for a new generation. Yet others quietly fear something valuable may be disappearing in the process. Because once emotional traditions begin fading inside a family built almost entirely on tradition, the consequences can become impossible to fully contain. The symbolism surrounding Louise's situation has therefore grown far beyond the original controversy itself. To many royal watchers, the revoked access no longer represents a disagreement over estate management. It represents a painful sign that the unwritten protections once surrounding certain family bonds may no longer exist in the same way. Questions continue haunting palace observers. Who truly pushed for the restrictions? Was this merely administrative restructuring, or part of a larger struggle over influence and control within the monarchy's future? And perhaps most unsettling of all, did senior figures fully understand the emotional damage such a decision could cause before it unfolded? The palace's silence has only deepened those questions. Every refusal to clarify details, every carefully managed public appearance, every controlled statement has intensified fascination surrounding the story. Because silence inside royal life rarely kills speculation, it feeds it. And in the absence of answers, the public has filled the gaps with emotion, interpretation, and growing concern about what this situation reveals regarding the monarchy's future direction. Some see Louise's reported withdrawal from public life as temporary heartbreak. Others fear it reflects something more lasting, a quiet emotional fracture between generations inside the royal family itself. And perhaps that is why this story continues resonating so deeply far beyond Britain. Because at its core, it speaks to something painfully universal. The fear of losing connection to the people who shaped us. The fear of watching cherished places become unrecognizable. The realization that institutions, traditions, and even families sometimes evolve in ways that leave certain people behind no matter how loyal they have been. Lady Louise never appeared to seek power, status, or attention. Yet according to royal whispers, she may still have found herself caught in the unforgiving tide of change now reshaping Windsor from within. In the end, the monarchy may survive this controversy just as it has survived countless crises before it. Public duties will continue. Ceremonies will move forward. Palace gates will open and close with the same precision they always have. But emotional wounds inside royal family rarely disappear as neatly as official statements suggest. They linger quietly beneath tradition, resurfacing years later in ways nobody fully expects. And for many watching this unfold, that may be the most haunting part of all. Because inside the House of Windsor, the hardest doors to reopen are never the stable gates, they are the ones that close quietly inside the family itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.